So, before I get into what the Mises Caucus does, I should probably tell you what the Mises Caucus is and where it came from, because that animates what we do. So I'm going to get into my origin story with you. So, me, like so many other libertarians, am a product of the Ron Paul Revolution. Who here came out of the Ron Paul Revolution? Now, my first encounter with Ron Paul was a YouTube video that's still there, and I still have the top comment on that video called Ron Paul American Pie. And that was my very first introduction to a lot of the ideas that turned me into a libertarian. You know, he spoke about how peace is not radical. You know, we just accept war in this society. What's radical is the decade of war that we were coming out of at that point in 2008. It's not radical to expect peaceful people to not be caged. Incarcerating millions of people for nonviolent drug offenses is radical. He talked about the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, and how they all failed and how they were all animated by propaganda. And they were all animated by controlling the narrative. He talked about the Federal Reserve and inflation. And that was my first introduction to these ideas. And I took those ideas, I was so excited, I never heard anything like this in my life. And I took these ideas with me to school and I started debating all these kids and sharpening my intellectual tools. And, you know, of course I was being told over and over again, you're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy. But I didn't accept that. And I kept reading and I kept on the grindstone. So, fast forward to 2012. Now, I'm a little bit more schooled, and I knew I had to do something when he was running again. But the energy this time around was different. In 2008, I was just a kid. You know, we had dial-up internet and one computer in the living room that we all shared. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know what to do. You know, how do you figure these things out? But in 2012, I was moved to action, and I wasn't moved to action just by the ideas. I was moved to action by the community and the culture around those ideas. When I say moved to action, I was marching down the streets of Philadelphia with a bullhorn. I was sleeping on the streets in Occupy Philly on the weekends while working during the week because we had a Ron Paul tent at Occupy Philly. The community and the movement around the ideas kept me in that. I was moved to action not just by the ideas, but by that community. And that's when I really dove into the ideas. And that's when I really started studying and really started reading the Mises Institute. So then we're going to fast forward again to 2016. Gary Johnson was running. My hope was that we would be able to light this movement up again. But that's not what happened. There was a big difference between the Ron Paul Revolution and the Gary Johnson campaign. You know, Ron Paul, in front of a bunch of conservatives, had the audacity to tell them that we should legalize heroin. And he got a bunch of conservatives to cheer that on. And again, this is just another example of the courage and the character attributes that animated that movement. Gary Johnson, though, he was in a town hall on CNN, and he was challenged on this same thing. And he had a moment to speak a bold truth. But he recoiled and said, no, I just mean weed, man. I just mean weed. The character traits, courage, bravery, those are the things that animate people. Ideas by themselves are not enough. You have to have the inspiration to push them forward, the characters to push them forward. Ron Paul talked about ending the income tax, how 1913 was the worst year in American history because we got the income tax and the Federal Reserve. Gary Johnson wanted to add the fair tax. So there was a huge difference in vibe and in feeling, in culture between the two experiences. The Ron Paul Revolution didn't feel like a campaign. It felt like me and my friends were in this underground world and we were on a mission to save the world. When's the last time you could say that about politics? When's the last time you could say that about a campaign? That is not how the Gary Johnson campaign felt. The Gary Johnson campaign felt like politics. So this is where the idea of the Mises Caucus was born, the need to recreate that energy, that culture, recreate the positive feedback loop that Ron had started by igniting the liberty movement and put it all in the guise of an institution, an organization, because unlike a singular campaign, an institution never has to die if you get that feedback loop going. So again, I had started studying. Again, I highly recommend that you guys, if you've never heard of the Mises Institute, to check it out, mises.org, mises.org. Now, who was Mises, briefly? Mises was the godfather of what we call the Austrian School of Economics. He put his first major works out in the early 1900s, and to put it briefly, the main point of the Austrian School of Economics is that economics is a social science. It's not a science like physics. You can't deduce how economics runs by formulas and tests. It's, at its essence, it's human interaction with each other. That's what economics is. Not numbers, not money, all these things, not necessarily. And that the principles of economics are deduced by stripping the logic of human action and deducing the logic. So it's a very different take. Now that might sound very wonky, but it has huge implications on how you do economics and how you derive economic policy. It's a radically individualistic free market school of economics. There would be no Ron Paul without Mises, and therefore there would be no liberty movement without Mises. So that's why we went with the Mises Institute, to honor the Austrian tradition, to honor the Ron Paul revolution, and bring that back into the fold under the guise of the Libertarian Party. There was a lot that Mises has added to economics that is commonly accepted today. You know, the subjective theory of value, the socialist calculation problem, separation of state and money. These are all radical ideas. So again, if you don't know what the socialist calculation problem is, Mises.org. So, the Mises Caucus. How do we differ from the Libertarian Party? Why do you need a Mises Caucus? Well, that brings me to what exactly is the role and the purpose of the Libertarian Party. You know, is it about politics? Is it about the pursuit of political power? Or is it about ideas and culture and starting a conversation? The founders of the Libertarian Party didn't think that it was about pursuing political power, not primarily. They said it was an evangelical quest to spread the ideas of liberty, to change minds. How are we ever supposed to cultivate a group of voters unless we create more libertarians, unless we change minds first? That's what it's going to take for us to earn our seat at the table. And I would argue that if we ever put the pursuit of political power in front of the message, we will have already become what we oppose. So we have to keep the Libertarian Party to its roots. We have to reclaim. Now again, the ideas are not enough. You need a narrative. You need story. So liberty is about reclaiming the story that founded this country. That's what we have to recapture. The ideas are not enough. So why is the Libertarian Party needed? What is libertarianism? Libertarianism is about cooperation, the cooperation that emerges out of a peaceful society. It's about the cooperation that is obtained from freedom and property rights. It's the foundation of society itself. French free market economist Frederick Bastiat, he has this great quote that where goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. It's a really important concept. It's a really fundamental concept because it's applicable to other things. Because not only is that true, but it's also true that where you don't have communication, conflict will arise. And where you don't have cooperation, that's where government comes in to fill the void. We fundamentally have to cooperate with each other, or else government will create that lack of cooperation for its own ends and its own needs. This is why government divides us. This is why statist ideologues have captured all the institutions of society, so that they can divide us and push their ideologies through the power of the state. So what do we do about it? We have to challenge the idea of the government as a solver of problems, fundamentally. That's what has to be changed. And again, we have to reclaim the story, not just the ideas, but the story, the narrative. This is what animates people. Well, in order to do that, we have to be heard before we can ever be relevant. And we have to be relevant before we can ever be trusted. Now, trust is recognition plus consistency and character. Fundamentally, we have to become people that other people want to trust, want to believe in. We have to become the symbols of the ideas that we embody. You do that by being being successful, striving for something, facing the odds, and doing that in front of people, staying radical and principled while being respectable at the same time. We have to do this because we have to infiltrate the culture. It's not enough to be on the outside looking in with the greatest ideas. If the ideas were enough, we wouldn't be in the status predicament that we're in right now. So culture and politics are linked. And again, this is why Facebook algorithmically divides us. It's why Hollywood is captured by ideologues. It's why academia is captured by ideologues. They want to use these institutions to capture the culture, to make it normal and want people to want more statism. The nature of government is force. That is not a new idea. That's George Washington. But while that might be true, the nature of the control of government is not always force. It's mostly psychological. It's mostly cultural. Government doesn't have to control us. We control each other. We keep each other in line because they set the narrative, and we're social animals. Nobody wants to be on the outside looking in. Nobody wants to be rejected. Nobody wants to be a leper. But fundamentally, that's what we're going to have to be willing to risk to take up these new ideas and to challenge the culture. So we have to challenge not just the ideas, but the narrative. We have to infiltrate the institutions of society. We have to do the groundwork from the bottom up to change that narrative. We do that by being brave, but also by being empathetic, consistent, authentic, and unique. Now, the biggest platforms anymore, for the longest time, traditional media channels were what controlled society. There was a monopoly on the exchange of information. That is now gone. That is now gone, and the media is desperately trying to hold on to whatever crumbs they have. But anymore, what was my origin story? It wasn't the media. It was a YouTube video. What are the biggest platforms today? It's not the media. It's Joe Rogan. It's the podcasts. It's the dissident media. But those platforms are also the ones that are the most ripe. They're the ones where the young people are gathering and flocking. They're the dissident media. They're the ones that are outside of the bounds of the official media channels that push their ideologies for people to want to vote in more statism. They put us into algorithmic bubbles on social media so that we never communicate with each other. So the impetus is on us to be the catalyst. The impetus is on us to be the ones to cross over. We have to talk to all these different bubbles. We have to be the ones to break into the new platforms. We have to be on the cutting edge. The time is now to do this. Trust in media is at an all-time low. Trust in the system is at an all-time low. Trust of the narrative is at an all-time low. That is a recipe for us to infiltrate. That is a recipe for us to gain access to these new platforms and push our ideas forward, push our narrative forward, our story forward. We have to talk to people as if we are representing libertarians, not talking at people to get their votes. We can't talk like politicians. We have to talk like visionaries. We have to inspire. Coronavirus has changed the game. It has been normal. Authoritarianism has been normalized. We just put up with over a year of being told whether or not you can go with your wife to her OBGYN appointment, whether or not you can go to your father's funeral, whether or not you can have your face covered. They've infiltrated every minutia of our lives at this point. But now that narrative is crumbling. I mean, we see it here today. I don't see too many masks here today. We're in a strange place where that puts you at the cutting edge of the narrative, by the way. Like, you know, walking into the grocery store with your full face on, you are now challenging the narrative. But that's what it takes. It takes being willing to be a pariah. There's been trillions of dollars printed, mass movements of people from the cities, skyrocketing prices of production goods, mass loss of small business. Trillions of dollars in bailouts to crony corporations. This idea of total control of life has infected all the way down to the local level. Mayors are instituting these measures and have been refusing to give them up until recently. It's inflamed the culture war. The culture war is driven by a centralization of power. The executive branch has gotten so powerful, so consolidated, that these different culture groups that make up America are basically in an existential threat for the political power that the executive branch represents. And that's why you've got riots in the streets. And that's why you've got street fights between conservatives and liberals. It's why everything is getting out of control. The central government dictates the culture and basically establishes whose culture is supreme in society. What do we do about that? The answer is decentralization. A quote from Mises on the concept of decentralization. However, the right of self-determination of which we speak is not the right of self-determination of nations, but rather the right of self-determination of the inhabitants of every territory large enough to form an independent administrative unit. If it were in any way possible to grant this right of self-determination to every individual person, it would have to be done. We have to break up the monopoly power of the federal government and return it to the people, and that's how we reclaim our story. So that brings us finally to what is the Mises Caucus? What are we doing about it? Well, the Mises Caucus has what I like to call our three-pronged strategy. Number one, we call it intra-party activism. Events like this, recruiting people into the party. Primarily the liberty movement. There's millions of people who identify philosophically as libertarians. And yet there's only 21,000 members of the National Libertarian Party. We're not doing very good at recruiting our own people. I would argue that the reason for that is that if you look at the liberty movement as a demographic, it resembles Ron Paul much more than Gary Johnson, to put it simply. The liberty movement is our customer base. They're not obligated to be here. They are who we have to make sure that we are representing and taking care of in order to get them into the party. So, intra-party activism, recruiting, getting people involved at the local level, becoming members of the state party, and growing the party. Plank 2 of the three-pronged strategy, candidates. However, the primary political principle that we as a Mises Caucus are after, as I outlined, is decentralization. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like focusing at the local level, not worrying about these unwinnable races. It's about being realistic. And there's an outsized power at the local level. You know, there's a really important concept of nullification. You guys are all familiar with this. Who here is a fan of decriminalizing weed? That's nullification. Sanctuary cities for immigration, that's nullification. Second Amendment sanctuaries, that's nullification. Everything that is not in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is reserved for the people and the states. That is all ripe ground for us to decentralize and take that power back through local level legislation. So We run candidates at the local level to nullify the federal government. My little bumper sticker for this is that it's much easier to get elected to city council and nullify the federal government than it is to get elected to the federal government and then change the federal government. There's a fat chance of that happening. So candidates, local level and president. President is the big opportunity to speak our principles to a wide audience. That's how we coalesce our base. That's how we get people excited. That's how we share our narrative and create a culture around the ideas. That's what is needed for the movement to take root and become a force. And then the third prong of the three-prong strategy is issues. Libertarians are uniquely positioned to work with both Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals on issues of overlap. We might not agree on why, but that doesn't matter. The end result matters. You know, if you live in a blue town where you have a supposedly progressive city council, well, how progressive are they really? Are they decriminalizing weed? If they've already decriminalized weed, are they decriminalizing psychedelics? We can push them. We can be the force that makes the progressives actually be progressive and the conservatives actually be conservative, and nobody has to give up their principles to do this. So that is the mission of the Mises Caucus. So that's it. Thank you. Hard ending, yeah. So if you have any questions, I'll be around, and ask me them. And if you like what you hear, go to takehumanaction.com, sign up for our email list, and our organizers will be in touch, and we'll change the world. Thank you.